Hello, I'm Ernst Röhm, and I would like to share my story with you. I was born on November 28, 1887, in the Bavarian region of the German Empire. My father, Guido Julius Joseph Röhm, worked in railway administration, and thanks to his government position, our family lived relatively affluently. I had trouble getting along with my father, who was often described as a disciplinarian. Nonetheless, when left to my own devices, I showed great potential as I naturally gravitated toward my interests and pursued them with vigor whenever given the opportunity. My mother, Sophia Emily Röhm, was someone I described as the best wife and mother in the world, stating that she loved me the most of all the family. I had two older siblings, a sister Emily and a brother Julius. I was closer to my sister Emily than my brother Julius, and despite her moving to Austria after she was married, we held a close bond. I grew up in tumultuous time in Europe as Germany had thrust itself onto the world stage, turning a once shattered array of small duchies and kingdoms into an economic, political and militaristic powerhouse hungry to prove itself. The German unification movement began in 1862, 25 years before I was born, under the leadership of the famed Otto von Bismarck, who had skillfully challenged Europe as if facing an opponent in a chess match. The North German Confederation was officially dissolved on January 18, 1871, and the Prussian-ruled German Empire was established. And while the German unification would not be complete for some years with Habsburg-ruled Austria, Hungary remaining sovereign, it was the closest the German people had yet come to the realization of a cohesive German nation-state. A relatively united German world, living in the shadow of competing empires, shaped my views on European politics. I attended the Royal Maximilian High School, but was unmoved by academics, deciding to join the military instead, and officially joined the Royal Bavarian 10th Prince Ludwig Infantry Regiment as a cadet on July 23, 1906, in the garrison town of Ingolstadt, and received my first commission on March 12, 1908. With the outbreak of the First World War, I became the adjutant to the König Regiment's 1st Battalion, which was sent to Riemeli near Metz to defend the border and railways. I first saw action at Flainville on August 25, 1914, and by September 10, I had only 8 active officers in the field. After suffering terrible casualties near Gellencourt and while fighting in the Spader in Lorraine, I was struck in the face by a shell fragment which shattered the bridge of my nose, leaving the first and most distinctive of more than a dozen wounds that I sustained during my service in the First World War. After recovering, I would be given the rank of First Lieutenant, Oberleutnant, along with the command of the 10th Company at Ailey Wood. Following my promotion, I spent time in France and Romania, commanding troops at the Battle of Verdun in June of 1916. My company would be the first to storm the French trenches and take the redoubt at Thiamont. I was wounded repeatedly, most dramatically by a bullet passing close to my lung and exiting my shoulder, but I survived, receiving the first of my military honours, the Iron Cross First Class, for my outstanding devotion to duty and bravery on all occasions since the beginning of the war. Following my recovery, I was accepted into the War Ministry under Colonel Koller and appointed as adjutant to the head of the Army Department. By April of 1917, I had been promoted to Captain Uptman. In mid-May, I was sent to Făxani, Romania, to work as an adjutant to the divisional staff for the 26th, 27th and 28th Infantry Regiments and the 22nd Artillery Regiment. However, towards the end of 1917, Russia and Romania negotiated a truce, which meant that my division was moved to Metz to retrain for the Western Front. I left Romania on April 17, 1918, and continued to serve on divisional staff until October 2, when I was transferred to the Garda Corps staff. After numerous officers came down with the Spanish influenza, I was made 3rd General Staff Officer, which allowed me to consolidate and better evaluate all reports from the front for my division. I also had control of all scouting missions from aerial to ground units. In October of 1918, I was transferred to the 12th Bavarian Infantry Division when they withdrew from Flanders and became the 2nd General Staff Officer tasked with receiving feedback and complaints from troops. By this time, I had gained a reputation with my comrades for bravery and even rashness, showing little concern for my own safety. The Spanish influenza struck the Triple Ententes with devastating force, and even I came down with the flu. I was admitted to a field hospital on October 20, 1, 1918, and later transferred to Halle near Brussels. My case of Spanish influenza had become so severe that the divisional doctor feared for my life and suggested they should replace me, but I eventually recovered after a lengthy convalescence and returned to my post at St. Sauveur on November 3, 1918, only to discover that my post had been taken after all. Only 8 days later, the First World War would officially end. Following my return to health after my second bout of Spanish flu in less than 2 months, I travelled back to Munich. I arrived only a few weeks after the November Revolution, during which the Bavarian Soviet Republic had been declared and Bavaria's former noble ruler deposed. A sergeant discreetly approached me and recommended I remove the black, white and red cockade of Imperial Germany from my cap. The sergeant whispered, "That is how far things have got here." I sought out Lieutenant Colonel von Sonnenberg, questioning the failures of the Bavarian army to react to the threat of a communist revolution. The colonel responded that the revolt had taken them by surprise and that they must allow it to develop quietly and run its course. This left me discouraged. I regarded this strategy as an unpatriotic betrayal, believing that the commanders of the Bavarian army had shown their cowardice, lack of resolve and inability to act. Hastening to comply with the advice of the trembling civilian bureaucracy, these military commanders, in my eyes, had surrendered themselves to the mutinous mob without standing up for the king and Kaiser, effectively hiding from their responsibilities. And so, I felt compelled to leave Bavaria along with other army officials in February of 1919 to join the Freikorps, a right-wing nationalist paramilitary organisation. During my journey, my train was halted near Dachau as Kurt Eisner, the leader of the People's State of Bavaria, had just been assassinated in Munich after losing control of the government. His killer called Eisner a Bolshevik and a Jew, not a real German, which illustrates the fraught political climate in Germany at the end of the Great War. I was lucky to make it to Ohordruf, as many potential troops and officers intending to join the Bavarian Freikorps, like myself, were caught and arrested. My return to Munich saw me becoming active in political life with the German National People's Party and becoming a frequent speaker at meetings. I quickly became displeased with the party as I deemed them too narrow-minded, many of them coming from higher socio-economic backgrounds than myself, but it wasn't long before a friend invited me to attend a meeting of the German Workers' Party. I was instantly attracted to this new organisation and was among the first few dozen people to join the party, which would attract many orators, including Adolf Hitler. Upon reporting to the Freikorps General Staff Officer, I would be assigned to Colonel Franz Ritter von Epp as an aide. I excelled at management and was tasked with the command of catering and supplies. When I was first given the position, the Freikorps were experiencing constant supply problems, but under my guidance, the trains full of weapons, equipment and horses began to roll in regularly. It is believed that I illegally requisitioned the weapons and supplies from stocks pilfered from the former German army, including caches of weapons which were supposed to have been destroyed under the Versailles Treaty. The logistical company assigned to handle everything became overwhelmed by the supplies flooding into Ohordruf. By April 14, 1919, the situation in Bavaria had deteriorated so dramatically that the Räterepublik Ministry decided to speed up the formation of the Freikorps in order to deploy them. The Bavarian Soviet Republic, seated in Munich, had fractured, and the People's State of Bavaria was formed. Seated in Bamberg, military supplies were ready for mobilization when the first troop transports left Ohrdruf on April 22, with many more to come. In the following days, the Freikorps was sent via Stuttgart to Ulm on the western side of Bavaria, and only 2 days later, on April 24, 1919, the Freikorps 24 marched into Ingolstadt after short skirmishes with the Spartacists. But the Bavarian Freikorps did not fight alone, as the Landschaft and Swabian Freikorps, as well as a small detachment of the German military, worked in tandem to surround Munich. Although joint operations broke down, the Bavarian Freikorps did manage to capture Munich on May 2, 1919. I had never seen myself as an overtly political figure, but I understood that due to my standing as an officer, I would inevitably be thrust into a political position. I argued that the imperial authorities had discouraged military officers from political pursuits or participation, believing that it lay outside their duty and capacity. I was surprised by the relatively apolitical attitudes of officers, especially since 94s of active officers had been either killed or wounded in the imperial political pursuits of the First World War. I believed that this statistic alone should have encouraged a more politically active attitude. I believed that an officer could be as apolitical as a mercenary in a foreign land in which he serves, but not in his own country. The politicians and parliamentarians now had influence over the army, something that had never occurred in the old regime. I would continue to view the military, but not the politicians, as the supreme instrument of an increasingly dangerous people's nationalism. On February 24, 1920, at a mass meeting in the famous Munich beer hall, the Hofbrauhaus, the German Workers' Party presented the 25 points of its programme to the public for the first time. This, in the minds of many historians, constituted the founding of the Nazi Party, and news of the event pushed the party into the public spotlight. In the spring of 1920, I began attending meetings of the group Iron Fist, or Eisenfast, held in the apartment of Captain Beeper Romer. This political organisation held strongly nationalistic views as well as some revolutionary aims. It would be here that I would first be introduced to Adolf Hitler, a training officer at the time and a captain major. As a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles following the First World War, Germany had been significantly demilitarised to prevent another world war, and further action would be taken by the Weimar Republic with the Reich Law for the disarmament of the population in 1920, which would jail citizens for 5 years if they knowingly withheld information about secret weapons caches. Further humiliation in my eyes would occur on January 21, 1921, when the German army was reduced from a fighting force of 200,000 to 100,000. Members of the armed forces had hoped that the German government would refuse, and their anger and frustration grew, and yet another capitulation to the Allies and the ordnance depots at Bamberg, Munich and Ingolstadt were ordered destroyed. On July 29, 1921, after significant internal party struggles, Adolf Hitler was elected chairman of the newly named National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as the NSDAP. I, who was already an ally and friend of Hitler, had grown intrigued with the NSDAP stormtroops, known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA, when I was invited by Captain Hess to establish a Reichsflag, or National Flag Unit, in Munich. I wavered on the offer, reluctantly accepting. But upon building up a small following, I quickly threw myself into recruitment. Commenting on the frenzy surrounding these nationalist movements, I observed that flaming protests and mass demonstrations are certainly valuable to whipping up sentiment and are perhaps often indispensable. But if there is no man to make the practical preparations behind the smokescreen and then act, they will be without effect. I became convinced of the need for an ultimate clash between nationalist militias and the internationalist and anti-fatherland, allied and parliamentary-dominated government forces. The merger between the Social Democratic Party of Germany and the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany was an admission of the desire to counter the nationalist and Völkisch movement, and an expression of the anxiety felt over the movement's steady growth. On October 8, 1922, Bavaria replaced First Minister Graf Lürchenfeld with Eugen von Nilling, a pro-nationalist politician, and Hitler's Nazi Party was successfully gaining traction. With fascism rising successfully in Italy, it only emboldened the nationalist cause. The Vienna newspaper Neue Freie Press wrote on December 14, 1922, that Hitler had once been an outsider, not really taken seriously, but was now the strongest power in South German nationalism. In an effort to curb the effects of the nationalist climate in Bavaria, the government placed the Bavarian Reichswehr under the control of the main army and made them subordinate to the Reich President and the command headquarters in Berlin, separating them almost completely from the influence of the Bavarian state. To me, this was a coup, an attempt by the Reich to divert power away from Bavaria and the nationalists. According to a memorandum sent out by the leader of the Bavarian Freikorps, Colonel von Epp, an official of the Bavarian government named Deputy Erhard Auer had made, quote, a series of personal attacks against Captain Röhm and his colleagues, which were to some extent fictitious. In reality, Auer had quite reliably accused me of weapons smuggling, in addition to racketeering, political violence, murder, and desiring to impose a military dictatorship in Germany, uniting it with Austria. As a result of these accusations and the increasing pressure from the presence of my right-wing militiamen, as well as the earlier order assimilating the Bavarian military into the command of the Reichswehr, I was transferred and demoted from General Staff of Infantry Leader, 7th General Staff, 7th Division. I was deeply frustrated by this blatantly political move by the Social Democrat-controlled Reichstag, and Colonel von Epp refused to accept their choice for my replacement. This move by the Social Democrats was designed to gain control of the weapon stocks in Bavaria, a plan which had been long in the making ever since the introduction of the disarmament laws. But due to their inability to convince the men guarding the weapon stocks to release them, the Social Democrats sought to weaken their resolve by removing me and other officers who would openly resist the disarmament of the Bavarian army. To me, the Reichswehr had become a puppet for the Reds, a government that could be wielded by whomever controlled the Reichstag. I described 1923 as a distressing year due to my separation from Colonel von Epp and the Freikorps, not to mention the criminal charges I faced, none of which, however, resulted in conviction. But the experience, nonetheless, left me bitter about having to defend myself from what I referred to as salvos of abuse. A clear demonstration that, like most Nazi Party members, I viewed law and justice as flexible, relative, and mostly secondary to questions of power. As a result of Germany's inability to deliver the reparations owed to the French and Belgians, the two countries forcefully occupied the Rhine and Ruhr. On January 23, 1923, the Reichstag passed a half-hearted resolution to hold, quote, a solemn protest against the occupation of the Ruhr by armed force in breach of international law and treaties. They claimed that the Reichstag would, quote, support the government in any measure of purposeful resistance to the act of force by any means. Munich reacted with extreme protest, with many condemning French imperialism. As the government scrambled to unite the Reich, the NSDAP made plans for a two-day rally in Munich, originally scheduled for the 27th and 28th of January 1923. Rumours circulated that Hitler planned to use the rally as a springboard to a coup, and Bavaria, in response, imposed strict regulations on the rally, leaving Hitler outraged and demanding the right to hold the rally outdoors to ensure the greatest number of attendees and as big a fanfare as possible. Hitler's threats to use force led Bavaria to declare a state of emergency, but Hitler would find the support he needed within the Reichswehr itself. As government troops increasingly flocked to his side, causing increasing unease within the Bavarian government, Hitler assured them that all he wanted was a peaceful rally. And so, after meeting with numerous officials, the rally was eventually approved. I, along with many other nationalists, viewed the government's reaction to outside threats, such as those of France and Belgium, as mild in comparison to their treatment of their own right-wing domestic groups. However, groups like Hitler's Sturmabteilung, SA, commonly known as the Brown Shirts, were frequently seen bullying targets in the streets and invading rival political party spaces using intimidation and violence on the NSDAP's behalf. However, Hitler vehemently denied that such things were happening, blaming wealthy Jews for circulating lies. On January 23, 1923, I was appointed a member of the policy staff of the Reichsflag, or National Flag Unit. I was empowered now to make political decisions. I began by working closely with Hitler to quietly consolidate the various right-wing nationalist militias into an amalgamated pro-fatherland Kampffund or battle league to support the Nazi Party's eventual seizure of power. Formed initially as only a loose confederation of groupings by the spring of 1923, I was being increasingly pressured to end my involvement with the group, as their activities and military exercises would be, quote, highly welcome material to the French. I resigned my leadership role with the Reichsflag and distanced myself from the Kampfbund Policy Committee. But nevertheless, by the early summer of 1923, tensions would grow still further. The Kampfbund Policy Committee presented the Bavarian government with a declaration in an attempt to prevent a May Day parade from being held by socialist and proletarian militias. They claimed a Soviet-style armed parade was an affront to the people and a grim reminder of Bavaria's Red Revolution of 1918. The Kampfbund Policy Committee thought this declaration would provoke the Bavarian government to declare a state of emergency, cancelling all political activities. But instead, the Bavarian government stumbled and failed to respond. Reports of communists arming themselves, despite later being proven false, provoked the nationalists into calling a meeting to consolidate their allies and mobilize a force of their own. On the morning of May 1, the Kampfbund set up their battle line on the Oberweissenfeld, while the May Day demonstrators mobilized at Theresienwiese. I had been asked to mediate between the two groups, but mindful of government scrutiny over my previous involvement with the Kampfbund, I refused. But apparently, no Bavarian government official believed my denials of involvement. And on the day of demonstrations, I discovered that my telephone had been tapped. Following the May 1 standoff, I was relieved of my post and was instead appointed company commander in Bayreuth. However, I resigned from this commission the same day I received it. But administrative and procedural negotiations prevented the acceptance of my resignation, giving me time to quietly continue to work and plan for the fruition of the NSDAP's plans. By July, the international situation had further deteriorated and France was demanding subjugation from Germany, with Poland and Czechoslovakia also snapping at their heels. I used this moment of nationalist uproar to return to the leadership of the Reichsflag and lead them in a massive rally which took place between the 25th and 26th of July. While I still doubted the overall military strength, unity and readiness of the Kampfbund, I realised that the nationalist situation was urgent. The Reichswehr and the state police would be used as a weapon against us if we failed to unite in an organised, disciplined way. And following an impassioned speech to the leadership of the Kampfbund, Hitler's exhortation to fully support his political leadership was received with acclaim. I described it as a highly emotional moment, and with the unification of the nationalist cause under one leader, I submitted my second formal resignation to the army. The consistent attempts to suppress the Kampfbund left Hitler in a fighting mood, but I advised patience. Hitler issued an order prohibiting NSDAP members from joining any brigades unaffiliated with the Kampfbund, and tensions would build throughout October when the Bavarian government forced the Reichsflag to disband. Defiantly, I reformed the group under the new name Reichskriegsflag, also known as the Reich War Flag or RAFK. A further escalation of tensions occurred when the Republic of the Rhine was declared in Saxony under a Marxist government, aggravating anti-communist nationalist sensibility. This, along with the rising rate of inflation in the German state as a whole, created the perfect storm. On November 8, 1923, State Commissioner Gustav von Kahr was leading a meeting of officials at the Bürgerbräukeller Hall with nearly 3,000 people in attendance. Hitler and his paramilitary forces surrounded the beer hall, and at 8:45 p.m. they stormed the building to command the crowd's attention. In the confusion, Hitler jumped onto a chair and, firing a shot into the air, promptly proclaimed the dissolution of the government and the establishment of a nationalist republic. Within the hour, the NSDAP had announced the composition of both the new Bavarian government as well as the provisional German nationalist government and had placed Kahr in protective custody. I was tasked with delivering news of the coup to the War Ministry, and when my order to accept the new government was rejected and the sentries refused me entrance, I seized the War Ministry by force. Hitler arrived at 11:00 p.m. to greet and congratulate me and the RAFK. Yet an uneasy atmosphere still prevailed. It was still an open question whether the government and its military forces would either accept or oppose the coup. Meanwhile, I was still holed up in the War Ministry when I heard reports that the Reichswehr and state police were finally en route to drive me out. I prepared my officers to defend the War Ministry, giving strict orders not to fire upon Reichswehr troops, stating that the Reichswehr is nationalist and sooner or later will stand shoulder to shoulder with us in the struggle for liberation. And after lengthy negotiation, the terms of surrender arrived, which were to honourably lower the RAFK flag, surrender all weapons to the state police, and surrender me to state custody. Lacking any alternative, I accepted the terms of the surrender, and while I was being taken into custody, Hitler was shot whilst leading a march on Munich, but was whisked away before he could be captured. On November 12, I was taken to Neudeck for my first hearing and transferred 2 days later to Stadelheim prison to await trial. The Putsch had failed. Whilst in prison, I authored a pamphlet entitled Saviour of the Fatherland to counter the claims that Kehr had saved the country. To me, Hitler was the saviour acting in defence of the Reich, while Kahr was the suppressor, and according to my perspective, the revolution of 1918 had ruined Germany. The forced acceptance of blame for the Great War had crippled their political and economic standing. Germany had been robbed of Upper Silesia, the Rhine, and the Ruhr without any attempt to retain those territories, and the Reich's ongoing policy of international appeasement was starving the German people. On February 26, 1924, Hitler, myself, and the other Putsch conspirators were brought to trial. All were convicted and sentenced, but I was one of the few given a conditional discharge and thus served no jail time. Following the trial, Hitler and 4 other conspirators were incarcerated, but none would serve their full sentences. During his imprisonment, Hitler would write his manifesto Mein Kampf. In the meantime, Hitler requested that I begin rebuilding the Kampfbund forces, a process which had been forbidden by State Commissioner Kahr. The Reichstag elections of May 4, 1924 brought stunning results as the National Socialist Freedom Party won 32 seats, one of which was taken by me. While in government, I sponsored bills relating to the rights and conditions of soldiers at the front, the treatment of prisoners of war, and the intervention for the Ruhr fighters in French jails. In the wake of attempts to reform some of the militia groups, such as the Reichsflag, the Bavarian government proposed the Einwohnerwehr, an emergency force that would absorb all fighting forces under government control. In response, I prohibited prior Kampfbund members from submitting to the Einwohnerwehr. I met with Captain Göring, who was in exile in Innsbruck, to plan a major conference for SA leaders to take place on May 17 and 18, 1924. I founded the Front Ban, or Front League, in order to consolidate the fighting brigades within the Reich. Following Hitler's release from prison, he refounded the NSDAP despite it having been banned, and Hitler offered the command of the SA to me, but I declined to accept the position unless my conditions were met. While few of my colleagues would have attempted to impose conditions on Hitler, I described my relationship with him as an honest friendship and was frequently observed speaking to him both openly and informally. On April 26, 1925, I presented Hitler with a memorandum stipulating my conditions for acceptance of the leadership of the SA. I would be in sole command of the Front Ban, and it would remain an independent organisation within the movement. Also, they would be forbidden involvement in party affairs, nor could they take direct orders from political leaders. Lastly, the Front Ban would only accept directives from state authorities and the Reich Army if they were deemed necessary for the protection of the fatherland. These conditions clearly highlighted the orientation of my politics, which were belief in the power of the citizen soldier who could violently exercise his political will without being subordinated by politicians, and belief in the military as the ideal instrument of nationalism. Hitler vehemently disagreed with my proposal as he wanted the Front Ban merged with the NSDAP. Thus, I declined Hitler's offer and resigned my position. Captain Weiss wrote at me, wherever Captain Röhm appeared, there was life in the place, and above all, practical work was done. He was the real founder of the German Kampfbund and the soul of this creation. Following my resignation, I moved to Bolivia, where I served as a military advisor for the Bolivian army. One of the most frequently repeated facts about my personal life is my sexual orientation, as I lived virtually my entire adult life as an openly gay man, a fact that sometimes perplexes those familiar with the traditionalist views of the Nazi Party, with which I was so deeply involved from the beginning. Having spent most of my life as a soldier, I approached life with a hypermasculine aggressiveness, which some biographers have speculated might have been a counterbalance to my homosexuality due to society's view of gay men as naturally effeminate. My attitude and militaristic view aligned me with the NSDAP, but both my openness about my sexual orientation, as well as the very fact of it, would make me many enemies within the party. Following the failed Strasser revolt, an attempt to splinter the NSDAP, Hitler recalled me to Germany to lead the SA under somewhat more lenient terms. I returned to find the SAA disorganized mess, hardly a competitive unit. My first act was to establish new groupings, or groups that encompassed many regions under the command of an SA Gruppenführer who answered only to Hitler and myself. The SA under my leadership exploded into a powerful organization that would rival the size of the Reichswehr by nearly 20 times. The SA's main activities involved threats, intimidation, assaults and street battles with communists, political rivals, Jews and others whom the Nazis perceived as opposed to the nationalist cause. The contrasting politics of the brown shirts with their more middle-class or elite fellow party members were apparent in their support for labour strikes and their willingness to publicly and viciously beat strikebreakers. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, a small subsection of the SA, formed an intense rivalry with its parent organisation. As the leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler was looking for a way to break free of the SA's jurisdiction. The SS had taken over the important role of protecting the top Nazi officials. While the SAEC was increasingly viewed as little more than uncouth street thugs, the SS members were fanatically devoted to Hitler, and this devotion made them perfect bodyguards. They quickly became an elite organisation within the Nazi Party. When the Nazis assumed full power in 1933, I was made a minister without portfolio, as well as being named Reichsleiter, the second highest political office in the Nazi Party. In this position, I made major political moves. My first attempt was to merge the SA into the Reichswehr, but Hitler felt threatened by this proposal, as it gave the impression that I might be preparing to overthrow the government. Not only did it threaten Hitler, but it also threatened everyone in the existing military structure who were likely all insecure about my extreme popularity with the SI. I wanted to make the Reichswehr a training organisation for the SA, but I made enemies by trying to consolidate the two. In an attempt to ease the tension, I tried to compromise by stating that only a few thousand of the SA would be allowed into the Reichswehr. But my proposal was rejected outright. Many SA members felt that following the Nazis' rise to power, Hitler had not done enough to reward them for their service during the camp fight or fighting times. They were hoping for radical social changes that would elevate their position, yet nothing of the sort had happened. The members of the SA were relatively poor and typically came from working-class backgrounds, unlike the primarily middle-class SS. The rivalry between the SA and SS would become increasingly bitter under my leadership. The SA created some of the first concentration camps for political prisoners and other undesirables. From the perspective of the Nazi Party, the introduction of the camps marked the height of my power. But this displeased Himmler and Göring, heads of the SS and Gestapo respectively. The SS opened their own camps to rival the SAs in 1933, and it wasn't long before Himmler also successfully gained control of the SA's concentration camps, replacing their staff with the SS Totenkopf or Death's Head Regiment. Hitler held both fear and contempt for the power the SA could wield and wished to reduce their numbers. I resisted heavily the proposed reduction of the SA and instead expanded them, leading to speculations of a potential SA coup. Hitler would resist suppressing me directly but subtly worked against me. With aging President Paul von Hindenburg on the verge of death, Hitler attempted to gain the army's support by promising to reduce my influence and focus on rebuilding the Reichswehr and Kriegsmarine. A political power struggle ensued as Himmler, Göring propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, and I all fought for control. Both Himmler and Göring despised me for my open homosexuality, as well as my tolerance of it within the SA leadership. Hitler himself had always known of my homosexuality and seemingly turned a blind eye due to my undying support for the National Socialist movement. Our friendship might have played a role as well, as I was the only Nazi official who was ever allowed to address Hitler as Adolf or Addy instead of me and Führer. As a result of Himmler's and Göring's hatred of me, Göring transferred de facto control of the Gestapo to Himmler on 20 April 1934. This consolidation was done to counteract my influence, and with the tension growing in Germany over my increasingly egregious demands, Hitler was threatened by Hindenburg, who warned that if he did not act to contain me, Hindenburg would declare martial law and allow the army to take control. It was probably at this point that Hitler realized the SA was becoming more of a liability than an asset. In preparation for the political purge, documents were fabricated to suggest that I had received payment from France to overthrow the Nazi government. Leading officers of the SS were shown the falsified documents on 24 June 1934, implicating me and the SA in a plan to overthrow the government. With the intention of luring the SA leadership into a trap, Hitler requested a meeting with them in Bad Wiessee. On 30 June 1934, Hitler, along with SS officials, burst into the Hanselbauer Hotel and arrested me along with other high-ranking S officials. In the early morning, Joseph Goebbels, who was with Hitler during the initial arrest, returned to Berlin and issued the code word Colibri or Hummingbird, unleashing the execution squads on the other unsuspecting victims of the purge. Hitler would make a public spectacle of the hotel raid, claiming treachery and moral degradation of the officers as a cause for the mass arrest. I and other SA leaders were accused of planning the coup, as well as indulging in sexual activities culturally offensive to the Nazi Party's policy. Most of those arrested that morning were executed immediately, yet for unknown reasons, I was simply imprisoned during the initial round of arrests. Hitler, perhaps because of our friendship, might have been reluctant to order my removal. However, on July 1, 1934, 2 days into the purge, he finally made the decision. SS officials came into my cell, presented me with a pistol, and told me I had 10 minutes to peacefully exit this world on my own terms, or they would force my departure. I replied, if I'm to leave this world, let Adolf be the one to make it happen. With my death, Himmler gained the autonomy he sought with the SS, and Göring was finally able to rid himself of a rival. In an attempt to erase me from the party's history, the Nazis destroyed all known copies of the propaganda film The Victory of Faith in which I had appeared. My world was shaped by the wars and political chaos of the mid-20th century. Germany had become a politically unstable country following the First World War, with communist and fascist movements fighting for control of the government. The stalemate was only broken with the success of Italy's fascist movement, along with the actions of highly militaristic and rabidly nationalist individuals like myself. It was the inability of the Weimar Republic to form a fully functioning government that could meet the people's needs, which allowed people like me and Hitler to take advantage of the people's desperation. I was instrumental in Hitler's rise, as well as the creation of the concentration camps, which the SS would grimly perfect. Following my death, the SA would slip into obscurity, as they had outlived their usefulness.